Well, the memoir is also about being an art critic. I had been looking to publish my art criticism in book form, so I was actually looking and speaking to Irish publishers about maybe producing a collection of my art criticism as published as journalism. And I'd been in conversations with a few different publishers about that, but the publisher who was most interested was Merriam Press, Irish Academic Press. And I went back to them during the lockdowns. We were on a Zoom call and I was talking to the publisher there, whose name is Conor Graham, about a format for the book that would work for a wider audience. So I had said to him, I'm thinking about writing personal essays to go with the journalism to talk about what was going on in my life when I saw the art. So he said, tell me more about that. So I talked to him more about that. I described a scene where I was, which is in the book now, where I was in the family law court in Cork. And I looked up and I saw this artwork hanging from the ceiling, and it was a sculpture by the artist Maud Cotter. And I looked for the wall label and it was called Home. And I was in this place, it's a family law court, so it's a place where the legal system is taking apart families and homes, as they have to when separation and divorce happens. And I just thought, oh, here's this fragmented sculpture hanging from the ceiling called Home. And here I am in this place where we are technically and legally taking apart a home, as has to happen when a marriage ends. So I spoke to him about that and he said, that's really interesting. And I said, well, you know, for me, art is in the world and in my life everywhere I go. So he commissioned the book as a series of 8 essays. That's how it was commissioned, to interweave the practice of being a critic and how art has functioned in my life, how I've related to art. And when I wrote it and sent the manuscript, the publisher said this reads like a memoir. So I did a tiny amount of editing on the first and the last chapters just to maybe take account of the idea that it could be read as a memoir. And that's why Negative Space exists now as a book. Yeah. I think in the book I talk about how art is an escape and also a place to kind of come home to yourself. So for me, because I grew up with, my mum is an artist, so I grew up not only surrounded by art and making, but also visiting exhibitions all the time. And I also was reading from a really young age and writing. So writing, reading, looking at art, all of these things were kind of interwoven basically into some of my coping mechanisms, I suppose. Like a thread that runs through the book is, of course, the ending of my marriage, time of trauma and stress and difficulties. And for me, having to get in the car, drive to an exhibition, spend time looking at an artwork, translating it into words, that was a practice that grounded me again, you know? So I suppose some of the book describes how that practice of doing that helped me at a really difficult time. And it's two things. It's like losing yourself in the art, but it's also finding yourself as well, which you can do in words as well as in visual art. So, and in music and, you know, so many things, creative endeavors, yeah. I can't speak for everybody, but I do think part of the creative impetus is around that idea of putting shape on something, being able to hold it here and look at it and say, well, that is done now, I can put that down. So the tattoo thing is curious, it's sort of interesting. There were lots of layers to that, right? So some of it is to do with taking ownership of my body again. I think a marriage ending and maybe a betrayal in a relationship rocks your notion, your sense of self, but it also, and for me, I describe in the book how my own relationship with my body, I didn't want to eat anymore, you know, these things happened, and trying to get back into my own body. The act of, like, I saw it as commissioning a piece of art for my body. That's how I saw it. And a type of taking ownership, and also maybe marking something, like literally marking something, but marking something so, yes, to move on, you know. And the book for me really feels like I have put a shape on the story that I am happy with, that I feel has integrity, that I hope speaks to other people, but primarily was for me a question of putting a shape on my experience, putting language on my experience, and then being able to say, here it is, you know, in order to maybe move on and do the next thing, you know, not be carrying that with me, you know. I've been writing about art in a newspaper for 20 years. In that time, the whole world has changed. Technology has changed. When I first started filing copy to the Sunday Times, I was on a dial-up internet connection. We didn't have Instagram. We didn't even have Google. Right? So in a way, journalists were sort of hidden behind the words in the paper unless you had a byline picture or whatever. People often mistook me for a man. They thought I was a man writing just because my name is not necessarily obvious that it's Cristín. So there were letters to the editor sometimes talking about your critic, he, you know. So that's interesting. So that much hidden, you know, in that nobody really knew my identity. But I think with social media, and then I started to do more television and radio and stuff, so I became more visible. But still, and this is a theme in the book, in a way, the role of the journalist is to not put themselves into the story, right? And so writing a memoir is very much putting yourself into the story. So another thing I was doing in the writing of the book was trying to explore that balance between those two things, trying to explore those two things at a time when everybody's personal lives are more public, or can be if they choose to make them. And maybe we expect to know more about the writers that we read. Like, we might expect them to have a social media presence, which people in the past didn't. And then there's a shift in journalism too, towards personality-driven journalism, you know, towards following a certain writer because you're interested in their particular take. So these are all interesting things that have shifted in the period of time that I've been writing. And they're part of what I was trying to unravel for myself, that question of what are you hiding and what are you revealing, and how much do you want to reveal or not. And of course, a memoir is a choice to put certain things in your book and also not to put certain things in your book too, of course. Yeah. Negative space. And for me as well, I think a lot of what readers get from a book is the story they bring to it themselves. So I have had people speak to me about how much the book has meant to them when they read it, but it has resonated with something in their life, so something that happened with them. And those are the extra bits of the story that I don't know about, because that's their story, but they're bringing their story to the book. And I talk about that when I'm talking about when you meet an artwork. I'm really interested as a critic in the moment of encounter with the artwork. So in a way, I'm less interested, in terms of my practice as a critic, I'm less interested in why the artist made it or what happened in the studio, although that is certainly interesting. When I write, I'm more interested in trying to capture and put words on what happens when I bring me to this thing you made. What happens here in this moment of encounter? That's what I get excited about when I'm writing about art. And I think if I do it in a way that works, I hope that the reader can also say, oh, I can bring my feelings to this too. So I'm really always working towards this idea that the critic's word shouldn't be some kind of final statement on an artwork. It's simply a moment now of this encounter between this person and this work, which of course changes too. You could go back to a painting in 20 years' time and feel completely different about it, or a piece of music or whatever, because of what's happened in your life. The artwork hasn't changed, but you've changed. And so then the meaning that exists between the two of you has also shifted, you know? So I think that's really interesting. I think it has opened things up. It feels to me like there's more possibility there within the writing to push at the edges where it was changing anyway, in the ways that journalism is changing anyway, and yeah, it feels more open. It feels less closed down. I think there's potential there to explore those things even more. Although I do still think of the practice of reviewing art as a separate practice. That is a different practice. particularly for a newspaper. You know, I think the practice of being a critic in a newspaper is a very particular thing, and it's also a kind of a dying profession because we don't have staff art critics in Ireland in newspapers. Even in the US, I know the numbers of staff critics have dropped. So it's not a profession that you can go into now, and I've been freelancing for 20 years, and say I'm going to get a job as a critic, a literary critic, a film critic, any type of critic. Cultural criticism is something that's sort of struggling in that way, but it's because media is changing. So I think I'm interested in the extra possibilities, the new possibilities that doing something like this might open up. And I love to read memoir, and I love personally to read about other people's practices, about how they work and why what they've learnt, the things that they've learnt along the way. I think that's really interesting. So I'm hoping I could contribute something to that, you know, space maybe. Yeah.